I'm delighted to hand over to Omar Mohamed, who's going to take us through now until lunch. Omar, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just wait for my mic to turn on. Everyone can hear me in the back okay? Yeah? I have a very quiet voice, so I need the mic. I need the extension. So my name is Omar Mohamed. I will start by introducing myself, which always feels really long. But yeah, I think there's lots of different lenses that I come at you from today that I think is really important for the presentation. So yeah, my name's Omar. I'm 23 years old, born and raised in London. Don't live in London anymore. I'm a children and family social worker, long-term children safeguarding. I'm also a lecturer and a researcher when I find the time. I'm an expert by experience, so I've experienced having social workers in my life for the first 16 years of my life, as well as a current sibling kinship carer, I think is the right term nowadays. And there's probably lots more labels that I could go into, but I think something that I was probably going to do anyway, but more so important that, that we've had the first amazing workshop around intergenerational, and I want to open up my generations, my multi-generations, and kind of make that with you guys, and then also throughout my presentation. So being born and raised in London, my parents and grandparents were born and raised in East Africa, so in Uganda and Kenya, and then my ancestry comes from Gujarat in India, as well as the longitudinal ancestry comes from Persia, which is now Iran. So that's the kind of intergenerational, multi-generations that I talk to you at today. And I think it's really important that, I'm able to share that, and actually we share that a lot more in practice, throughout research, those sorts of things. And it's a kind of tie-in into this presentation, which is focused on family group conferencing. And I wanted to kind of introduce my involvement and my choice to learn more and more about family group conferencing. And I will introduce the model in the next slide. But in terms of why I was so interested, and it was my undergraduate social work dissertation topic, is because I was really looking for models of social work that I needed as a child, as an Asian British child, with the generations that I've talked to you about, with my parents experiencing social workers, my grandparents, my aunties, my uncles, everyone came together in my family when we were facing social work. And it was a very negative experience, unfortunately, and I think a lot of that is attuned to not having models of social work, of working with people that come from indigenous, diasporic, or kind of, models and ways of knowing that feel at home to racially minoritized people. Using a lot of terms that people may not feel like is the most kind of used term, or the most kind of, what's what I'm looking for, like the popular term. And I will also introduce those terms as well, but I'm just trying to kind of like piece it together, I think, from the amazing first workshop that we had that kind of talks about those generations. And yeah, just kind of making it clear why I was really interested in family group conferencing, which I will now introduce, which is, so family group conferencing it's a model of kind of shared decision-making, working with families collaboratively. And I think it started in 1991. Yes, it is. And it was introduced in the United Kingdom in 1991. But it's a model that's that has been used for a very long time, for generations, throughout the Maori communities in New Zealand. And I think what was really interesting about the power of the Maori communities is just how much they fought for a model that speaks to their values, to their cultural traditions, and all those sorts of things. And so, yeah, kind of linking into, being a child, a racially minoritized child in this country, or in England, and, having to face kind of culturally incompetent services to some extent. But I'll get into that a little bit more. So yeah, focuses very much on participating with families, very much on kind of acting together for that shared collaborative working. I kind of, make the point, and I think I was kind of taking that a little bit from the first workshop as well, about how many racially minoritized families will feel very much in link with indigenous or diaspora knowledge that feels at home to them and within their culture. When we think about like intergenerational working, for example, you can't work with me. So a social worker couldn't work with me as a child without working with my grandfather as well. It's impossible. And I do that a lot now in my social work practice, with any, client or, people that I'm working with. And I really see the value in it, and we talked, I think Jude was mentioning, that we must engage with family networks, we must think about kinship care. Too often in children's social care, the only time we think about grandparents is when we're removing a child and we need to find someone in the family, right? But actually, the grandparents should have been involved in, from the get-go, because for a lot of communities, there is so much importance, so much value, so much strength in engaging with the family network. And I think politically, that's where we're heading as well. I wanted to mention Miranda Fricker, who's been writing about the concept epistemic injustice. I've been trying to not get too academic in this presentation, but it basically just means some knowledge is valued less and it's disregarded than others. And I refer to indigenous knowledge. Māori is the indigenous community, but diaspora knowledge. When I say diaspora knowledge, I think about the fact that I am not living in the indigenous land of my people, my indigenous people from my ancestry, but the knowledge very much lives inside of me and seeds into everything that I do. So that it's the kind of both are devalued by Western knowledge and colonialism. So yeah, just quickly to mention those terms. When I talk about racially minoritized, I'm talking about like a doing action rather than being a minority. So we are the global majority. When I talk about my culture, when we talk about the global majority, we're talking about lots of different people that we work with as social workers. And then again, I think I've already talked a bit about indigenous. I won't get too much into the methodology, because I think that's the most boring part, personally. But these are the articles that were looked at within this systematic literature review, which thought to look at and kind of look into family group conferencing as an indigenous model, and just how kind of implement, that's not even a word, but how it has been implemented in the United Kingdom, and whether it is fit for the cultural needs for the racially minoritized populations we have in England. Unfortunately, it did focus on England. That's the thing with a dissertation, is you get told to hone it down. But there were research articles that I used, which were not England-based, but themes were kind of found in terms of cross-cutting themes. So I've kind of put loads of words up there in terms of what I found, which I found really interesting, and I hope it's interesting to you too. But we've, some of the key highlights, and I won't go into all of them too much, but thinking about family group conferencing coordinators and the role that they bring, and I say FGC coordinator, but I also talk about social workers and the role, because I see them similar but obviously different. And it makes us reflect on the characteristics of who we are as people when we enter these types of helping professions, and what we bring to the table. And actually, a lot of the research is finding that family group conferencing works really well, but also just social work practice works really well when we're able to reflect on ourselves, so that kind of critical reflection, what we're bringing, so whether we are enabling ourselves to look into someone's culture and being able to engage, to adapt services, to adapt to meeting, and all those sorts of things. But then also who we are, what we actually bring to the table, and the approaches that we take. I found kind of knowledge around just how appropriate the family group conferencing process is. And I thought what was really interesting is it was only really appropriate, and racially minoritized people in England really only found it to be appropriate when it was implemented in the way that the Māori communities effectively wanted. So too often we get family group conferencing or, social work services that are fit for, culturally diverse families or whatever the words are. Too often we get a kind of tokenistic way of approaching it. And the people leading that, haven't actually looked into the indigenous ways of knowing and the exact kind of principles. And really, I see FGC as it's a process, but also if you stick to the principles of it, you can't go wrong. So it's about maybe going back to those principles, which is really important. Things like, participation, co-production, all those sorts of things. I'm going to get into a bit around cultural competence, which will be a bit more of the workshop-y bit, and to try and get a bit more engagement, because I'm talking for too long now. So I'll leave that for now. And then, so my main research interest is decolonisation, and that was another real kind of passion for me because of my ancestral, kind of history and present of wanting to decolonise social work practice, research, academia, etc. And actually, family group conferencing does decolonise. And I actually thought the first workshop decolonises too. And a lot of people don't put the two together because I think people see decolonisation as this really complex thing. But it really is as simple as saying we need to work with our elders. And that's something that was really found through family group conferencing. The importance of elders, the importance of kind of, adaptation for like food and music in terms of culture. There were things found around cultural consultancy, which I thought was really interesting. So being able to kind of immerse yourself into a community and actually ask those questions. So, if you had no idea that you're working with a Muslim family and you had no idea that there are certain things that a Muslim family would expect if you were to host a meeting in their house, in terms of taking your shoes off and all those sorts of things. It's just about being able to ask those questions. And when you think of consultancy, you almost think like, you've got to pay this big, kind of, this person lots of money to tell you how you should do things. But actually, you can also just consult with the people that you work with as social workers, which I thought was really interesting. And then, a little bit around anti-racism and anti-oppressive practice, which I will get into. So, cultural competence. I've put a definition on the screen, and I don't love it, but it's just something to maybe promote discussion. Because I think too often, basically the one point I want to make from this slide is that cultural competence is a skill. It's like a muscle that we must keep working on. And too often, and when I deliver training for social workers in practice, they kind of always see cultural competence as like, oh, I can't know everything about every culture, right? But that's not what cultural competence is. It's not about trying to know every culture and, you've got a kind of, a medal from, achieving, all knowledge of every culture, because none of us can ever do that. And culture's dynamic, culture's changing. The way you would work with my family, being Asian would be different to another Asian family. So there was no such thing as being able to know everything. But what we should be doing is harnessing a skill of being able to ask those questions, being able to be respectful. I hate cultural sensitivity, but I love being courageous. We should be courageous, not sensitive, like beating around the bushes around culture. We should just ask the question in a sensitive way, but we should be courageous and we shouldn't be scared to kind of think about culture for the families that we work with. And then, talks a bit more about culture. And then, now I wanted to talk a bit about anti-racism. So, I don't know if you can tell, but that's me in the middle. It's meant to be me. This is my brother that drew this. Credit to him. But something that I really wanted to talk about in terms of being anti-racist and taking an anti-racist approach is kind of how we go about that. And it really lovely links into the first workshop in terms of intergenerational. And that's why I put the Bronfen-Benner ecological model, is because too often when we think about, working with, anyone really from a racial minoritized community, we're thinking about maybe just that orange circle. You see the person face value in terms of what's going on for them. We think about sometimes around their identity. We all come with this idea of like attachment and internal working models and all that sort of stuff. And then we automatically see how someone links into, engaging with social workers and maybe going to school, workplace, all those sorts of things, right? I've tried to make this applicable for both children's and adult services, so that's why it's a bit confusing. But then what I think we often miss is the wider systems. So thinking about the macro system that I lived in growing up as a child, which is systemic racism, social injustice, and how that kind of then connects through the circles or through the systems for myself, but then for many, many other racial minoritized people. And then thinking about the Corona system, which is that historical and intergenerational trauma. You know, I never had a social worker talk to me about colonialism and history and how that impacted my family and why they migrated and, you know, what that means for me now and, you know, when I learn about it in school and, you know, what kind of emotions and trauma that all of that brings up. And nowadays, you know, I'm talking about colonization in practice all the time. You know, I have a 12-year-old who keeps telling me that Star Wars and Dune were absolutely you know, kind of talking about colonization and and kind of systemic imperialism. And you know, you know, to be taught by a 12-year-old is lovely, and it's you know, it's the best part of the social work job. But he's so you know, he's so right that actually, you know, people want to talk about decolonization. They want to talk about anti-racism, but maybe at this point we don't have the platform for that. And again, I think that's why it links into exploring an indigenous model, like family group conferencing, that enables us to kind of look at indigenous ways of knowing, diasporic ways of knowing, and all those sorts of things. So that is everything I wanted to kind of churn out to you guys and say, to just you know, promote some discussion, really. I'd be really, really interested to hear your guys' thoughts. I know I said quite a lot. You know, I'd be interested to think about anti-racism, about decolonization, about cultural competence, you know, how we take all of this forward, you know, what is the next step, what you think maybe some of the challenges are of why we're not heading in ways, and, you know, maybe that real key link around indigenous knowledge and epistemic injustice, and, you know, why is it that, you know, some knowledge is valued more than others, and how do we challenge that? You know, how do we make things better? So all these really, you know, big unanswered questions, and I think we have some time to, yeah, have a look at those questions. Yeah, we've got 15 minutes, guys. So there we go. Yeah, I think there's a question at the back.
So Omar, you obviously know me. I'm Sarah Anderson. I'm part of SASWA and BASW. I'm part of the Lived Experience group as well. One of the things that you said, which I thought was really important, was about tokenism. So being like lived experience, like we obviously face that like constantly. There's a couple of my classmates. I'm just about to graduate. A couple of my classmates have actually come forward to me because I'm the class rep. And have said that during their placement, they were actually almost singled out as being non-white. Now, I'm in Glasgow. For people that don't know Glasgow, it's a pretty multi-diverse city. Let's make it a country. But to be singled out as being non-white and literally be taken into a conference for a child because their family are also not white is pretty abhorrent, especially right now. So I'm sort of like interested in that, but the way that we actually have to like treat our colleagues in Scotland and SASWA, there's quite a lot of research that's going on right now, and it is about racism, but it's not about racism about like the people that work with our service users. It's about this sort of like systemic racism that we are having as practitioners, and the way that that's just accepted, which is just incredibly wrong. So I was really interested when you were talking about tokenism for like the people that work as the service users.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. Thank you for that, Sarah. I think something that really, what you've said reminds me in the research, and you know what I was looking into was often when you had an FGC coordinator or social worker allocated, I'm also bringing in, you know, practice examples and lived experience examples. If you had a social worker, or you had, you know, a child that was adopted, or whatever it looks like, and often you get this term of like cultural matching, and I think that's kind of what I think was happening in that conference, right? You know, is it that we need, more black and brown social workers, to be kind of simplistic in terms of race, to come in and work with all the black and brown children that we have, that are, clearly overrepresented in the children's social care system, in mental health systems for adult social care, et cetera, et cetera. And actually the research found that there are so many benefits to more black and brown social workers, people that already understood the culture, and, from a lived experience perspective, it's like, it just feels enlightening to some extent of, I don't need to explain myself again, they get me already. And there is that, but then there's the other side of it, which is privacy, which is shame, which is stigma, which is, I don't want them knowing because we go to the same church, and all those sorts of things. So there's so many different dynamics when it comes to culture, which is really interesting. I can think of working with unaccompanied minors. I'll give one example from, a guy from Afghanistan who said, I absolutely cannot have a therapist who looks like me. I need a white one because they don't think like they do in my country. Which I thought was really interesting. So culture, and we always have to think about, white as a race, white British as an ethnicity, all those things, that is a culture within itself as well, And there's a colleague, Dr. Yohai Hakak at Brunel, who does a lot of work around kind of the white culture, which I think is really interesting. We don't talk about it enough, I don't think, in social work practice. So yeah, you reminded me of all of that, Sarah, so thank you. Any other questions? They don't have to be questions, make comments as well.
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm a practitioner researcher from the southeast of England, and I was in a meeting last week with some researchers that I've recently connected with, looking at setting up a sort of inequalities network. And one of the things that came up in this conversation with the leader of this group, she is a woman of colour, and her original research areas were not necessarily related to race, but sometimes she was just sort of, because of the colour of her skin, because of her background, because of her culture, considered an expert on that. And that is, in the end, the direction her career took. But the thing that I've noticed in both research and practice is that no matter what your focus is, if you raise this as an issue because it's personally happening to you, the responsibility and the onus is then put on you to educate your colleagues, to fight against discrimination a lot of the time. I've spoken to social workers I've worked with in the southeast who, have said to managers, I've experienced this racism from a client, or from a colleague. Not necessarily racism, but microaggressions. And the suggestion has been, oh, why don't you set up some training? And that idea of that personal skin in the game ending up being your whole person, which people who are not minoritized do not have to deal with. You have the whole scope of everything, and you're not just considered an expert in that because you've gone through it. And I guess, on the one hand, it's a strength. You have personal experience, and therefore you have knowledge. But I guess the question is around that feeling of responsibility. Why does it always have to be us that does it?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think it's a really, really good point to make, and I think share, from all the things that we've talked about in these two workshops, I think ultimately everyone coming here today makes me think that actually you're all here because you recognise that it's all of our responsibility to look at these sorts of issues, right? And often I think the burden should absolutely not be on black and brown people to have to teach their colleagues and, do the emotional labour, because I think that's something we miss out, is all of that is trauma, within, not just for me, but, and whenever I see an empty chair, sounds a bit weird, but whenever I see an empty chair, I think of my ancestors with me, and this would be traumatic for them as well, And I think there's something really important about recognising that, and recognising when you need to be an ally, when you need to, live in solidarity, and you need to speak out, as well, which I think is really important. So it comes back down to that collaboration. But then in saying all of that, coming from an expert by experience lens and a decolonisation lens, we need more voices. So, those that feel comfortable and are able to deliver that training or to educate colleagues should absolutely be promoted, encouraged, given the platform to, paid is really important, and all those sorts of things. But yeah, so there's many more dynamics as well, but maybe the two basic ones I'm thinking of. But really good points, thank you. Got, more questions? Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Dorothy. I'm a practitioner with community team in London. And my question is, you are talking about decolonization. We do a lot about diversity and equality. So my question is, what's the difference now between decolonization in social work and equality and diversity? Because that's a lot of focus that brings us to trying to understand people's, where they're coming from, their culture, and what matters to people. So if you can just explain that to me, so that if I can take it back to see if I can add it to what we are doing already.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that, because it gives me a platform to maybe invite everybody. So BASW are starting to do some work around decolonisation, trying to understand what that means from a UK perspective, but also collaborating with our European and global partners in terms of decolonisation. Part of what we're doing is we're not being so precious about one definition of decolonisation. And at the moment, we're still kind of, as a group, starting to get together what we're really talking about here. There's so many different types of areas that we could be looking into. So I invite everyone here, and thank you for to join, absolutely, join the group, get in touch with me, and we can absolutely. Is my email there? Yeah, my email's there. So please do email me, and we can get you involved in the group. But in terms of just a very quick, because we've only got 5 minutes left, very quick kind of what I would say is the main point is you were already answering it yourself, which I think is really nice, which is that we just talk about colonisation. Too often with equality and diversity, it's about how we include people and, make things fair and representation, et cetera, None of that allows a conversation about colonisation. So decolonisation, and it's literally just the D next to it, it's really focused on introducing that concept, but also lived experience and the trauma and all those types of experiences and how we talk about that in practice, what that means for our research. It's thinking about, okay, so now we understand that colonisation happened and is still happening today. How does that impact everything that we are doing? Why is it that if you go into a social work like student classroom at the moment, and you look at the references of the PowerPoint of pretty much any lecture that's being given, you then look into the names of those people, and they're likely going to be old, white, middle-class men from a very long time ago. And that's something that decolonisation talks about, is the contribution of many voices of collaborative nature, and something FGC talks about. So it's all those things that decolonisation allows us to talk about, whereas EDI is just EDI, which is important, but just EDI. So I hope that kind of makes sense.
I'm going to be a little bit mean now, Omar, because we've got 2 questions that have come in online, so I'm going to throw them both at you.
Go for it.
The first is, do decolonisation, anti-racism and or anti-oppressive practice come up in discussions with social work students? And is there more we could be doing in terms of discussing stress, resilience, experiencing microaggressions and ways of reporting and escalating? So that's the first one from SJ. And then we have another one, which is, how do we work with others who aren't open to the background and influence of the chronosphere you shared? Could you expand on the idea of courage to discover versus cultural sensitivity and how we walk that line? 2 big, meaty questions there.
Yeah, 2, and I think there was like 4 questions in 2 questions. So let me try and tackle. I'll just take the iPad just so I can not forget them. So, in terms of whether it comes up with social work students, in my experience, I had to scream and fight to decolonise my curriculum, and it was decolonised, which was great. And we had a whole campaign, which led to a book called The Anti-Racist Social Worker, all those sorts of things. But yeah, that was my experience. Now working with many, many different social work university training programs, both the traditional but also others, in terms of like the fast tracks, decolonisation is absolutely needed. There's no way we can say that we have a decolonised social work curriculum nationally or internationally or anything like that. So there's lots more work needed. More that we can do around stress, resilience, microaggressions, reporting and escalating. It sounds like a very managerial question in terms of like how we help our staff, our people. I think it's about the culture, it's about having that organizational culture, but also the culture between, kind of just people rather than the hierarchical systems, being able to go to the people that, you find comfortable with and trust and all those sorts of things, but also that we can actually talk about it. Sometimes we have like an anti-racism policy. I've never seen a local authority have a decolonisation policy, which would be interesting. So I think there's some steps forward in relation to that. So some people aren't open to the influence of the chronosphere, apparently. That's a very Western way of thinking, and it's, I say it as a kind of humour, but it's because I'm pretty sure like 90% of social workers haven't been able to have that in their education, to be open to the chronosphere, to link that to decolonisation, to engage with people's ancestral backgrounds. Too often, well, we're just not taught how to do that. And I know, having worked internationally in East Africa, as an example, that is all they do. They're taught the Western model of social work, and then they do whatever, well, they go and do what's fit for their cultural communities, which is so telling of, I think everything we've been talking about. And then of courage to discover versus cultural sensitivity, how do we walk that line? I think, I'm not the biggest fan of the word cultural sensitivity. I get why it is there, because we should be sensitive and respectful. But I think where I tend to go towards courageousness is because I think too often I hear social workers tell me, I don't know if I can ask that question. What if I offend them? But it's like, you're a social worker. So surely you can apologise if you do offend someone. Come on. We know how to do conflict resolution, etc., etc. But we have to ask. I hate that my social workers never asked really about my culture and my experiences of racism at school. So I never felt comfortable, being the first one to start that conversation. So I think if we don't be courageous, you will miss. It's almost like painting a picture, but you've completely missed the colour purple, which is my favourite colour. How can you paint a full picture without purple? You just can't. So yeah, hopefully that answers.
We have one more brief
yes,
question in the
please.
room, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Hi.
So you will get your lunch.
My name's Paul from Sussex and Kingston. I'm interested. So cultural competence, that word for me is a little bit, it's almost like it's not enough sometimes.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like sometimes you get this idea, it's almost like people feel because they know what's happening for you, that's it, we leave it there. So there has to be a cultural responsiveness as well, otherwise it feels that tokenism, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I suppose the next bit is how do we ensure cultural, not just cultural competence, which is hugely important, but cultural responsiveness? How do we ensure that there is action as well as the knowing part? How can we do that?
Yeah. I think we should write a paper on cultural responsiveness. I like that. Yeah, I've never heard that before. No, I think that's it. I think that's, cultural competence, it can be limited. I think it's almost limited to the Western, modernity of how knowledge has been formed anyway. But I think hopefully cultural competence will be seen as that muscle, that skill that needs to continue to be worked on, and it will never ever be perfect. We'll never ever be able to get everything perfect in social work practice with every culture that we work with. But it's about the value, what we actually value. We want to be responsive. We want to feel competent. We want to just ask those questions and be respectful. And not miss it out. I think that's the biggest value, because I would say it's socially unjust to miss out someone's culture completely. And that would be against our social work code of ethics and values. So I think, maybe it comes back down to the values, which is a very diplomatic answer. But yeah.
Okay, we have run ever so slightly over time, and I don't want to keep you from your lunch any longer. So if we could just say a huge thank you to Omar, and also to Jude and Alison from the earlier session. Lunch is being served upstairs in the exhibitors area. And you've got a break now until 2:30. Thank you very much.